In 1993, a federal court in the Northern District of Illinois processed a civil asset forfeiture case connected to a heroin trafficking network. The network was estimated to have moved $2.3 million worth of narcotics. One of the names in that file was Bola Ahmed Tinubu, then a Chicago-based Nigerian national, not yet a governor, not yet a senator, not yet a president. The US government did not prosecute him. What they did instead is what nobody talks about. They returned $460,000 to him through a negotiated civil settlement, nearly $500,000, given back to a man named in a drug trafficking investigation under terms that have never, not once, been publicly explained to the Nigerian people. That is not an allegation. That is a court record. So the question this analysis is going to answer is not whether Tinubu had a relationship with the American federal agencies in the 1990s. The document already confirmed that he did. The question, the one that should have been answered before he was sworn in, is what the nature of that relationship actually was, and whether it has any bearing on how Nigeria is being governed right now. If you're new here, this channel exists because Nigerians deserve political analysis that doesn't stop where the pressure starts. Subscribe and stay with me. This goes deeper. Let's establish exactly what happened and when, because the timeline matters. The CIA allegation did not originate in this election cycle. It has circulated in Nigerian political circles for years, but it was weaponized publicly during the 2023 presidential campaign. Opposition figures, primarily from the Labour Party and PDP formations, amplified a specific claim that Tinubu had functioned as a CIA asset during his time in the United States, and that this relationship explains both why he was never prosecuted in the 1990s and how his political career in Nigeria was subsequently protected and accelerated. The claims spread rapidly from WhatsApp to Twitter to international press, and the Tinubu campaign responded by labeling it disinformation and moving on. Most of the media moved with them. Here is what that coverage consistently failed to separate. The CIA allegation is largely unverifiable. There is no declassified document, no named source with direct knowledge, no paper trail that confirms Tinubu worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. That claim, in the form it was circulated, cannot be proven from public records. But the DEA forfeiture case is different. That record exists. It is not disputed, and embedded in that record is a more specific claim that Tinubu's relationship was not with the CIA, but with the DEA, and not as a target, but as a cooperating source. That version of the allegation has more documentary grounding. It remains circumstantial, but it is not without basis. But the problem is that both claims, CIA asset and DEA informant, have been collapsed into a single narrative by both those pushing it and those dismissing it. And that collapse is doing deliberate political work. If you can frame the entire question as a CIA conspiracy theory, you discredit the DEA forfeiture record along with it. That is not an accident. That is strategy. Now, this story is not new. The 1980s and 1990s were a period in which American agencies, the DEA, the CIA, and the Treasury's financial intelligence apparatus maintained extensive contact networks inside and around Nigeria. The Babangida era, the Abacha era, these were years in which the US government was simultaneously pressuring Nigeria on narcotics and maintaining back-channel relationships to elements of the Nigerian political and business class for counter-terrorism and Cold War adjacent intelligence purposes. Transactional relationships between Nigerian figures and American federal agencies during that period are not hypothetical. They are documented in other cases. The question is whether Tinubu is one of those cases. And here is the fact that reframes everything, the detail that the CIA conversation has consistently buried. In most federal civil asset forfeiture cases, the government keeps the money. The entire legal architecture of civil forfeiture is built on the premise that the state seizes and retains assets connected to criminal activity. A negotiated return of nearly $460,000 is not standard procedure. It requires a specific legal and factual basis. That basis has never been disclosed. Nobody in Nigerian public life, not a journalist, not a legislator, not a presidential opponent, has ever stood before a camera with that court document and demanded a line-by-line explanation from the man who signed that settlement and then became president of Nigeria. That silence is the real story.
Now talk about who is actually benefiting from the state of this story, and who is positioned to lose if it ever gets fully resolved. Start with the legal architecture. Nigeria's constitution does not disqualify a presidential candidate on the basis of a foreign civil forfeiture settlement. The Electoral Act does not address it. The Code of Conduct Bureau's financial disclosure requirements do not reach back into American court records from 1993. This is not a gap that was accidentally left open. It is a gap that was never closed because no one designing Nigeria's political eligibility framework anticipated or perhaps wanted to anticipate a scenario in which a major candidate carried this kind of foreign legal history. The ambiguity is structural, and structural ambiguity always benefits the person. Now talk about who is actually benefiting from the state of this story, and who is positioned to lose if it ever gets fully resolved. Start with the legal architecture. Nigeria's constitution does not disqualify a presidential candidate on the basis of a foreign civil forfeiture settlement. The Electoral Act does not address it. The Code of Conduct Bureau's financial disclosure requirements do not reach back into American court records from 1993. This is not a gap that was accidentally left open. It is a gap that was never closed because no one designing Nigeria's political eligibility framework anticipated or perhaps wanted to anticipate a scenario in which a major candidate carried this kind of foreign legal history. The ambiguity is structural, and structural ambiguity always benefits the person already holding power. Now consider who benefits from the allegation staying alive in its current unresolved form. The Labour Party and PDP both have strong incentives to keep a cloud over Tinubu's legitimacy. A permanently skeptical electorate, particularly the under-35 demographic that drove the 2023 Labour surge, is an electorate that can be remobilized. The allegation doesn't need to be proven to serve this purpose. It needs only to circulate, to resurface, to remind people of a question that was never answered. Unresolved questions are more politically durable than resolved ones. And the ACP has its own incentive to keep the allegation in its current framing as foreign-sponsored disinformation, because as long as the question is framed as a conspiracy theory pushed by enemies of Nigeria, anyone who raises it can be cast as an agent of destabilization. The inflated, unverifiable CIA version is actually more useful to Tinubu than a clean, factual, documented version would be, because the inflated version is easier to dismiss. If the opposition was strategically smarter, they would stop saying CIA asset and start reading the forfeiture settlement into the record line by line in the National Assembly. They haven't done that, which tells you something about whether they actually want it resolved. Heading into 2027, understand what Tinubu's political survival requires. He needs the Southwest Bloc consolidated. That is his base, and it is largely holding. He needs the under-35 vote in Lagos and Abuja neutralized or split, because a unified youth vote is the only coalition that threatens him outside a structural ACP collapse. And he needs the narrative of his presidency to be about economic reform, not biographical opacity. Every time the CIA allegation resurfaces, it pulls the public conversation away from subsidy removal and Naira reform and back to a 30-year-old court case. His team knows this, which is why the strategy is not refutation, it is exhaustion. Run out the clock. Make the question feel old. In the North, this allegation does not land as a simple political attack. It lands as confirmation of a suspicion that has existed in Northern political culture since the 2023 primary, that Tinubu's power is externally oriented, transactional, and not rooted in any shared national project. Among Igbo voters, it feeds directly into the broader framework of a presidency perceived as structurally hostile to southeastern interests. And in the southwest, the Yoruba political machinery has responded by treating criticism of Tinubu as an ethnic attack, which itself is a positioning choice, not a factual response.
None of these groups are engaging with the document. They are all engaging with the politics of the document. Now notice who has said nothing. Not a single major ACP governor has stood before a camera and walked through the court filings and offered a factual explanation. They defend Tinubu politically, loyally and loudly, but defending someone politically and defending their record factually are not the same act. Not one of them has said, here is what the settlement was, here is why the money was returned, here is what it means. That silence is not loyalty. That is insurance. They are not prepared to stake their personal credibility on a document that nobody has fully explained, including the man who signed it. Follow the money forward from 1993. The $460,000 returned in that settlement is a starting point, not an end point. What has never been traced in any Nigerian financial disclosure law, because Nigerian financial disclosure law was not designed to capture foreign court settlements, is how that capital, and more importantly, the network that it represented, migrated into the political funding architecture that Tinubu built during his Lagos governorship from 1999 to 2007. The Lagos Inland Revenue Service, which he restructured and expanded, became the foundation of both his political dominance and his post-governorship financial influence. The question of where that build began and what the starting conditions looked like has never been put to him by anybody with the legal power to compel an answer. And this is where one specific mechanism keeps appearing in the documents that do exist. The technical assistance contracts awarded during the early Lagos governorship, the consultancy arrangements that restructured the revenue service, point towards a set of firms with American and British registered addresses, at least one of which had principals with background in U.S. Treasury financial intelligence advisory work. That connection has never been investigated by any Nigerian institution. We're going to come back to exactly what it means. But here is what almost nobody has connected yet, and when you see it, the entire picture shifts. What does any of this mean for Nigeria as a country? Not as a political contest, but as a functioning state. Start with the federal balance. A president whose foundational financial biography contains an unexplained chapter with a foreign government law enforcement apparatus governed under a permanent leverage asymmetry. Nigeria's relationship with the United States on oil sanctions waivers, on AGOA train access, on EFCC cooperation frameworks, on counter-terrorism intelligence sharing is conducted at the level of the presidency. That presidency has never voluntarily disclosed the full scope of his incumbent American legal history. That is not a theoretical vulnerability. It is a structural one. And structural vulnerabilities in the executive do not stay theoretical when bilateral interests diverge. For ordinary Nigerians, the consequences are not abstract. The uncertainty created by an unexplained presidential record does not primarily damage Tinubu personally. It damages the credibility of the system he leads. When the man at the top of the governance structure has a chapter of his financial life that he settled out of court with a foreign government and has declined to explain to his own citizens, the implicit message to any serious institutional investor is that the norms around financial transparency are negotiable at the highest level. That message carries a cost in risk premiums on Nigerian sovereign debt, in the caliber of multilateral partnerships Nigeria is offered, in the willingness of foreign capital to make long-term bets on an economy whose chief executive has an unresolved foreign legal history. On security, it doesn't matter at the level of street-level political consciousness whether the CIA allegation is true. What matters is that it circulates in communities where the security forces are already distrusted. A sitting president who cannot close the question of his own foreign entanglements, even if those entanglements are ultimately benign, provides a narrative frame to separatist movements, to anti-government agitators, to anyone who needs a story about why the Nigerian state is not sovereign in its own decisions. You cannot fight that narrative with policy. You can only fight it with transparency. And transparency has not been offered. Now, the Lagos consultancy thread I flagged in the power layer. The technical assistance contract awarded in the early Tinubu governorship to firms with American and British addresses with principals connected to American Treasury Financial Intelligence Advisory networks. This matters not because it proves a CIA link. It does not. What it proves is that the governance architecture Tinubu built from his very first days in executive power was deliberately internationalized in ways that no Nigerian public financial disclosure has ever captured. Whether that internationalization was purely strategic, a governor who understood that Lagos needed to look credible to foreign capital, or whether it reflects something more transactional, is genuinely unknown. But the mechanism exists, the contracts exist, and the fact that no Nigerian institution has ever examined them is itself a governance failure that outlasts any one administration. Here is the data point that reframes the national stakes in a way that most commentators have not raised. In 2014, Ghana published the full financial disclosure of President Mahama's assets, including overseas holdings, as a condition of an IMF facility negotiation. The disclosure was contested, it was imperfect, but it happened. Nigeria has never done the equivalent for any sitting president, not under Obasanjo, not under Jonathan, not under Buhari, and not under Tinubu. The comparison is not a judgment on Ghana. It is a measurement of what Nigeria has normalized and what that normalization costs in terms of the country's standing in every room where financial credibility is a prerequisite for serious partnership.
Now, let's be honest about the strongest case on the other side, because this analysis has no value if it only argues one direction. Tinubu's defenders make a legally coherent argument, and it deserves to be stated fully. He was never charged. He was never convicted. A civil forfeiture settlement in the American legal system does not constitute a finding of guilt. Civil forfeiture requires only that the government establish probable cause that the money was connected to illegal activity. It is a proceeding against the property, not against the person. A negotiated settlement means both sides agreed to close the matter. The government kept a portion of the funds. Tinubu recovered a portion. Neither side admitted to anything. To treat that 30-year-old civil settlement as a disqualifying fact, as proof of criminal conduct or foreign entanglement, is, they argue, to impose a standard that no Nigerian politician from any party, any region, any era has ever been held to. And if you applied that standard retroactively to Nigerian public life, the list of people who would survive it would be very short. That argument is legally sound. Here is where it fails. The standard being invoked is a legal one, but Nigerians are not a jury deliberating guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Citizens evaluating a presidential candidate or a sitting president are applying a different standard. Did this person give me a full and honest account of the material facts of his life that bear on his fitness for office? That is not a criminal standard. It is a political and moral one. And by that standard, Tinubu has offered a legal defense, not a factual explanation. He has said, in effect, the process was followed and I was not convicted. He has not said, here is what that process was about. Here is why the money was in that account. Here is the complete record. Those are different things. Conflating them, treating a legal defense as a complete account, is itself a choice, and Nigerians are entitled to notice that choice was made. The misconception that is most damaging to public understanding of this story is the binary that most people have settled into. Either you believe that Tinubu is a proven CIA operative under foreign control, governing Nigeria on behalf of Washington, or the entire story is fabricated political fiction with no factual basis. Both of those positions are wrong. The documented reality sits between them. There is a verified, court-recorded financial relationship between Tinubu and U.S. federal law enforcement in the 1990s. The terms of that relationship have never been publicly explained, whether it rises to CIA asset, DEA informant, or simply a man who settled a forfeiture case and moved on with his life is genuinely unknown from public records. But unknown is not innocent, and unknown is not sinister. It is unknown. And a country of 220 million people, a country with Nigeria's weight in African and global affairs, deserves better than unknown from the man it has entrusted with the presidency. Before we get to the part that changes the conclusion, drop a comment right now. Based on what you know, who do you think is actually driving this allegation back into public conversation in 2025? I want to see your read before I give you mine.
So, where does this go from here? Let's talk about the most likely next moves, not predictions, but patterns. The Tinubu administration's most probable play is continued non-engagement on the substance of the record, combined with escalating regulatory pressure on domestic media that attempts to relitigate it. We have already seen the shape of this in how the NCC has moved against broadcast platforms and how defamation suits have been used to raise the cost of investigative coverage. The goal is not to refute the allegation. Refutation requires engaging the facts. The goal is to make the cost of airing the allegation in legal risk, in regulatory exposure, and in access prohibitively enough that most outlets choose silence over scrutiny. The opposition's most likely play is to keep the allegation alive not in Nigerian courts, where they have already exhausted their options, but in American and British press, where the DEA forfeiture record can be surfaced without the legal constraints of Nigerian defamation law. This is already happening at low intensity. It will accelerate as the 2027 campaign calendar approaches, and it will be amplified by diaspora networks that have both the technical capacity and the political motivation to push it into international circulation. The wild card that nobody in Nigerian political commentary is adequately accounting for is the posture of the U.S. State Department. If any administration in Washington determines that the unresolved question of the Nigerian president's 1990 DEA history is useful leverage in bilateral negotiations on oil, on counterterrorism cooperation, on financial sanctions compliance, or on AGOA conditions, that leverage will be used quietly and without a press release. That is how bilateral leverage works at the level of statecraft. It is never announced, it is implied, it is understood, and it shapes the room before any official conversation begins. Nigeria's negotiating position in those rooms is weaker for every year this question remains publicly unresolved. Here is what to watch in the near term. If the EFCC moves against any Tinubu-adjacent financial structure in the next 6 months, watch that carefully, because it would signal not accountability from above, but pressure from inside the APC coalition, where internal power negotiations are ongoing. Watch whether any American congressional committee raises Nigeria's financial disclosure standards in the context of AGOA renewal discussions. That would be the first external signal that the bilateral leverage question is becoming operational. And watch whether the Lagos Inland Revenue Consultancy contract from the 2000s surface in any international financial investigation touching Nigerian capital flows, because that thread, if it is pulled, leads somewhere. Now, the question I put at the start of this video, not the allegation, the actual question. Whether the nature of Tinubu's relationship with American federal agencies in the 1990s has any bearing on how he governs Nigeria today. Here is the honest answer, assembled from everything this analysis has examined. The nature of that relationship cannot be determined from public records alone. What can be determined is this: the relationship existed and is documented, it was financially significant, it has never been voluntarily explained, and the governance architecture Tinubu built in Lagos from its earliest phase shows a deliberate internationalization of its financial structures in ways that a leader with nothing to conceal would have had no reason to obscure. Whether those facts add up to CIA asset, DEA informant, or a man who made difficult choices in a difficult decade and has since governed competently enough that the past should stay past, that conclusion is yours to reach. But you cannot reach it honestly if you only have half the information. And until today, most Nigerians had far less than half. If this trajectory holds, no formal inquiry, no voluntary disclosure, no external pressure that forces the question into the open, Nigeria arrives at 2030 with a precedent firmly in place. That is, sitting president's foreign financial history is a political variable to be managed, not a public accountability question to be answered. That precedent will not retire with Tinubu. It will be cited by whoever comes next as justification for the same silence, and the presidency will become institutionally a little more opaque with every cycle that passes without a reckoning. Here is the question I'll leave for the comments. If a formal, independent inquiry into the 1993 settlement and the Lagos consultancy contracts were launched tomorrow with the power to compel documents from both Nigerian and American records, which outcome would actually serve Nigeria better? A clean bill of health that puts the question to rest, or the full truth, whatever it contains? Think carefully before you answer, because those two things are not always the same. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening, share it with one person who needs to see it. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.